We have a session presented with Schneider Electric, and the topic is critical trends driving ESG agendas in 2022 and beyond. Joining the panel are Juliana Auinger, Partner and Vice President, Sustainability Business, Schneider Electric, Amar Gill, Managing Director and Investment Stewardship, APAC BlackRock, and Dr. Mark Konin, Group Chief Investment Officer, AIA. The SCMP's business reporter, Martin Choi, will be moderating the discussion. Martin, over to you. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Cliff, for the introduction. So to kick things off, let's invite our panelists to briefly introduce the sustainability strategy and ESG journeys of their organization so far. So Julie, let's start with you.
Sure.
So, how does Schneider Electric help clients, particularly in Hong Kong, lower their carbon footprints and improve their ESG performance?
Sure. Well, thank you, Martin, and thank you, SCMP, for having us here today. Please forgive me for being probably the first panelist speaker you've seen wearing flip-flops. Unfortunately, I'm due soon, so I couldn't fit into any of my usual nice shoes, so apologies in advance. But first, let me talk about Schneider and sustainability and ESG and how that all relates. So the core of our business strategy is to build a sustainable business. And what we've done is we've embedded sustainability both in our purpose, which is to empower all to make the most of our energy and resources, bridging progress and sustainability for all. And we've integrated into our company's mission, which is to be a digital partner for sustainability and efficiency. We've been quite fortunate and quite well recognized in the market to be, for example, one of the most sustainable companies in the world. We've consistently achieved great ratings in the market. But I have to say that didn't happen overnight. We were one of the earliest ESG adopters as a listed company. We started our sustainability barometer and started measuring ourselves against our sustainability ambitions over 15 years ago. So this is not something that happened overnight, that we've just jumped on a new trend. We've been embedding that in our business all along. And we never stopped there. Actually, every 3 years, we refresh our sustainability strategy. So the most recent one is our 2021 to 2025 sustainability barometers. We have made 6 global commitments, and we have also put ourselves to 11 targets that we challenge ourselves. So I'm just going to mention a few that I particularly like. We have committed to reduce the carbon emissions by 50% of our top 1,000 emitting suppliers. We have committed to grow our green revenue by 80%. We've committed that 100% of our primary and secondary packaging is plastic-free by 2025. And what I love the most is that we've actually committed to create job opportunities for the next generation. So multiply by 2 times the number of internships, apprenticeships, and fresh graduate hires that we have across the globe. So really 11 commitments that cover all of ES&G, as well as some local commitments that are relevant to the local markets and society that we live in. So that's what we're doing from a sustainability practitioner perspective. In terms of business, we're also embracing that. As I mentioned, we want to be the sustainability partner for everyone. So one example of what we've done from a business perspective and how we're helping our customers is we launched the sustainability business back in the end of 2020. The sustainability business is a 2,500 people global team, and our mission is to bring all of Schneider Electric's acts together so that we can really help our corporate customers accelerate in their sustainability transformation. So this is not just good business opportunity, but is also an investment on our side as an impact company to help accelerate change and address some of the critical situations that we're facing, the previous speakers have already mentioned, that we're facing today in the world. So I'm going to pause there.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Julie. So let's move on to Mark. What about AIA's sustainability strategy and ESG journey as an asset owner? So what do you look for in your investee companies?
Thanks, Martin. Thanks also for the invitation today. So maybe I'll start by sort of putting in context of the entire company, the group. We link our ESG ambitions to the purpose of the organization. And we believe that's very important because it's been well proven that purpose-driven organizations tend to achieve their objectives and are more successful. So we see sustainable investing as part of an overall ESG commitment in terms of serving our local communities. And as many of you may know, we operate in a number of countries jurisdictions across Asia Pacific. We're present in 18 different jurisdictions. And the history of the company now over 100 years, we've always been very close and embedded in local community work, which started really with CSR type initiatives. And I think what we've seen over the last 10 years is really that move on and become much more formalized and embedded in the way we set objectives at a strategic level for the group as a whole. And we see that as critical because as a financial services company, one of the things that we do within our communities is we mobilize domestic savings, and then we apply those domestic savings within the economies where we operate. And the key really for us as an asset owner, because when we talk about investing assets, we're investing our balance sheet assets. So we're totally in control. We don't have individual customers who are requiring us to do certain things for the portfolio. We satisfy our own ambitions with the portfolio, and we take that responsibility very seriously. So governance has always been a key criteria for us when we're investing. Governance really sets the stage and sets the scene for our interaction and our engagement with our investee companies. But obviously over the last several years, climate has become critical because it's become an immediate, firstly a risk, it's become an imperative, and also it's become a driver now where we are in our journey of generating opportunities to deploy assets. And that's sort of where we are currently. Sustainable outcomes are critical for us because we're primarily a life insurer and a health insurer, and our commitments and our liabilities to our policyholders are very long dated. When you buy a life insurance policy, we don't tell you when you're going to get your money back. We don't tell you how much money you're going to get back, but we have to make sure that when the commitment is due, when you need that policy to crystallize the financial outcomes, we need to make sure we have sufficient funds in order to meet that liability. So the long-dated nature of our business means that when we look at deploying capital, we're really looking for companies that issue either debt or equity that are going to be able to survive multiple business cycles. So the risks that come to the portfolio are really critical for us, particularly as we have a lot of loans in our portfolio in the form of bonds that trade on the market. So effectively, we're lending money to companies, and when we do that, we underwrite that credit, and we need to make sure that the company is going to be money good 20 years hence. So if you think about that in the context of environmental factors, we see environmental issues and changing circumstances and the way that investors value companies according to ESG and particularly climate risk. We see that as a major challenge over the long term. So some of the things that we've done more recently is we've started going through the portfolio through engagement with companies and trying to understand the risks that they're subjected to and trying to understand whether or how they're recognizing those risks and understanding whether or not their business model is sufficiently robust. So that involves exclusions. We can talk about that in a little bit more detail. We've announced last year that we've excluded all companies that are involved in mining coal or producing energy from coal as a commitment to sustainable outcomes, not because we're taking a strong stance in itself, but because we see the prospect of stranded assets in those companies undermining the long-term value of those investments that we've made. And that fits under the entire premise for the organization, which is to help our customers, our policyholders, lead longer, healthier, better lives. As a listed company here in Hong Kong, we have been required for a number of years to publish an ESG report, but we've been publishing our report for some 2 years ahead of that requirement. And each year, those of you who are familiar with it, each year we have continued to enhance the quality of our disclosures to the point now where we are adopting internationally recognized criteria for measuring our portfolios in terms of their carbon footprint, and then making a commitment over time to align those emissions with an eventual net zero outcome. So what we're now looking to do with our portfolio through engagement is work with our investee companies, firstly to help them understand where we're going, what our journey is in terms of making sure that our portfolio, our investment program is sustainable, and then sharing our knowledge in terms of what we're doing within the portfolio to complete that journey. So that involves a lot of interaction with our investee companies. It also involves a lot of involvement with our shareholders because some of you may know that AIA is very widely held globally. And as you know, environmental concerns is a really global feature now within the investment community. And they bring to us, through our interaction with our shareholders, their concerns and their standards, which we are learning from that interaction. So it's good governance. We're engaged in an ongoing dynamic conversation. And then from that, we're able to then distill what it means to us for our business, and then to transmit that out into the investee companies where we operate. ESG for us goes beyond, climate concerns go beyond the portfolio. Obviously, we occupy buildings, we've got AI Central, we're putting up a new building on Stubbs Road, as you know. So a lot of our commitment to sustainable outcomes, environmentally sound practices also permeate everything we do. But clearly, as a financial services company, we're not in the business of manufacturing. So most of what concerns us is how we deploy our capital, which really explains most of the interaction and the influence we have more broadly in terms of environmental aspects.
All right. Thanks, Mark. You've touched on some topics we might go a bit deeper into, some of the risks and opportunities. Now let's go to Amar. Can you walk us through briefly BlackRock's ESG and sustainability journey?
Okay, thanks, Martin. And I will try to be brief. BlackRock is a large organization. We have, the last figure was about $9.5 trillion US assets under management globally, of which about half is in equities, public market equities. And what is in public market equities? 90% is tracking indices. Some call it passive strategies, but our stewardship of those portfolios is still very active. But 90% is tracking indices. So if a company is in the MSCI China, MSCI Hong Kong, or any of the national indices that we follow, or the regional, sectoral indices that we follow, then we are a holder of the stock on behalf of clients. It's not our own money, unlike the asset owner. We are managing for our clients. But the point I would emphasize is we are a long-term investor. Our holding period is indefinite. As long as the company is in the index, we're a holder. But it's important for us to be exercising the fiduciary responsibility for our clients to ensure that the companies are on a path of sustainable long-term value creation, right? And that defines the stewardship role, which is the team that I'm in for APAC. Within BlackRock, the sustainability strategies, you could put it under 4 main pillars. One is what we're doing within our investment portfolios. And essentially, ESG is integrated into our investment portfolios. All the active asset managers, as well as on the passive side, we have certain ESG criteria that we need to meet. And if a company is below certain criteria, for instance, if it's more than 25% of revenues from coal, then it's excluded from our active portfolios. But a number of other companies, if they are in what we call lower tier in terms of climate practices and disclosures, then there's a much higher bar for them to be in our active portfolios, and generally they're not in our active portfolios. So there's ESG integration within our current investment portfolios. There is new sustainability initiatives, new sustainability joint ventures that we announced one with Temasek about a year ago on the private equity side. And other, on private equity and on fixed income, new products that we are launching. That's the second bucket. The third bucket is the stewardship side, where we engage with companies to, essentially, we want to understand their decarbonization strategies. And for companies that are in high carbon sensitive, high carbon intensive sectors, we are encouraging the companies to report by TCFD and SASB, and SASB obviously is becoming ISSB. But disclosures are important. We can discuss that a little bit more. But stewardship is one of the three main pillars of one of the four main pillars of sustainability at BlackRock. And then the final pillar is BlackRock as an entity, as a corporate. And we are net zero as a corporate. All our travel is offset by carbon credits. I should have said earlier, in terms of our investment portfolios, we have 25% of our existing portfolios are aligned towards net zero by 2050. And we've set a target that by 2030, that should be 75% of our portfolios should be aligned to net zero in the next 8 years. So that's a quick wrap of what BlackRock is doing.
So now we've briefly gone through some of the existing strategies currently in place. So now let's have a look at some of the trends that could shape the ESG agenda going forward. Amar, what are your thoughts on, are certain aspects of E, S, and G currently being overlooked, or does there need to be a rebalancing among these sort of factors, S and G?
There's been a debate on ESG as a concept and whether it's a useful concept. And I think that debate is intensifying a little bit in the last few months for various reasons. But when you think about it, environmental issues, social issues, governance, how similar is this? There are aspects that are common. I think good governance is key as an umbrella to ensure that you have responsible practices. There are aspects that impact the company, what is material for financial performance of the company. There's also aspects of what the company does and the company's impacts on the environment and the community, what they call double materiality, impact on the company and company's impact on the environment community. So when you think about all of this, three different buckets, ESG, impact on the company, impact on the environment, and then you have this ESG ratings and scores. What information are you getting? It's so many different criteria and one score, one ranking. I think what will evolve, in the last 4 or 5 years, the E in the ESG has had much more emphasis. I believe even in the conference here today, it's ESG topic, but practically all the discussion is on E. I think over the next few years, there may be a bit of rebalancing and a little bit more emphasis on S and on the G as well, which I think is key.
Thanks, Samar. And how about Julie? Do you have anything you'd want to?
I actually do agree, and I think the reason, and especially for Schneider Electric, our core expertise is in the E, especially in the carbon transition and the energy transition that was discussed very early on today. But actually, the S and G is what we started off with when we looked at our ESG agenda. So, 15 years ago, when we thought about sustainability, it was less about climate change, actually. Our CEO looked at our business and said, how can we be a sustainable business for another 180 years? And our portfolio was heavily leaning on, in France. A lot of our revenue was from France. Our executives are from the similar schools, similar backgrounds. And he understood the concept of being a sustainable business going forward meant you need to have diversity in your board, you need to have diversity in your workforce, you need to be inclusive. And actually, a lot of our initial sustainability activities and actions and targets were to do with the S and G. And I think only because we had the S and G solidified at some point before we can now focus our efforts in the energy transition and decarbonization. So I completely agree with you, Amar, that we need to make sure that we balance out the importance, especially in this part of the world. The G is very important, as you guys mentioned as well.
Thanks, Julie. And Mark, do you have anything to add about governance? I think you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, as a shareholder, when we buy equities or even when we're underwriting debt, governance is critical, because that defines the quality of the disclosures, the reliability that you expect in terms of how management behaves and performs, the checks and balances within how a company is managed and run. Absolutely critical, and it's dominant in our initial sort of desktop assessment when we go out and engage with companies. We go well prepared, understanding how shareholders are treated. But when you come out to more current trends, and I think these are the ones that generally get picked up in the public domain, clearly environmental concern has been number one. And it's interesting because I prefaced my opening comments about being connected to the communities in which we operate. But obviously, environmental issues are not local. There's a pollution element which is local. But when we talk about climate change, we're talking about the global impact of carbon emissions, which affect everybody on the planet. And particularly in this part of the world where we have large swathes of the population living on coastlines with the prospect of rising sea levels and the salination of fresh water supply. These are critical issues that then bleed into biodiversity as well. So climate is going to continue to be very, very dominant. And certainly in terms of global concerns and the concerns that come to us from our own shareholders, I think these are going to continue to dominate. But having said that, we're living through still here, and the rest of the world is sort of earlier in the exit from COVID restrictions. We're living through a period where working conditions have had to evolve very quickly. And one of the things we're doing this year in anticipation of that is we're doing a very large thematic engagement with all of our investee companies in Asia, which is 1,500 companies, in how work practices are changing and how responsible management are being in terms of understanding the impact that the circumstances around COVID have had and how it's disrupted supply chains and how they're interacting with their suppliers. Because we feel as we go forward, clearly climate issues will be very significant. But I think sort of societal attitudes and this whole concept of inclusive capitalism is going to put a lot more emphasis on how companies behave in terms of their certainly staff policies, but also how they behave as a corporate entity within the society, the community in which they operate. So we're trying to get a little bit ahead of that, anticipating that that's going to be a key issue. And I have to say the engagement is going to run through most of this year. Results are quite varied. We get responses so far at about 65% level, which is good. And when we follow up with face-to-face meetings or Zoom-to-Zoom meetings. And the practices vary quite substantially, but there are some really good examples of very good practices in this part of the world. And we sometimes think that in this part of the world, we're behind the rest of the world in things that we do. But that's not always the case, and certainly isn't the case in terms of the engagement that we've had, both firstly over the last several years on climate. There's some very responsible management in place, doing some great things, as I'm sure we're hearing from some of the sponsors, but also on work practices as well and supply chain management. We're getting some quite encouraging responses. And it's through that engagement, it's an opportunity for us to express, some of our values. And from our business, we look at what's causing health concerns, and a large part of what causes people problems are non-communicable diseases. So things that relate to your lifestyle rather than things that you contract within the community. And they're things that you can impact, you can change. If you change your lifestyle, your diet, your exercise habits, your lifestyle, you can actually improve your health. So these are things that we are very, very much interested in. We're at the forefront in terms of promoting business practices which improve people's behaviors around lifestyle. And that's something we try and get across through the engagement as well, and trying to get sort of workplace good practices in terms of having a healthy community and a workforce.
Right, thanks, Mark. You've talked a bit about engagement and inclusive capitalism. So I'm curious about some of the other ESG risks and opportunities that you see for some of the companies that you invest in, or in your investment portfolios. What should we be aware of in 2022 and beyond going forward? That some risks and opportunities.
Well, there's clearly a lot of disruption economically, which we're all contending with. Higher inflation, sort of nearshoring in terms of supply chains, and all those sorts of issues. So they all come into the mix. But I think from our perspective, the reason why we've chosen to go out and engage in terms of work practices is because we want to make sure that the companies we're investing in have employees in mind and the impact that they have on their suppliers as well. We think that is critical because there's a lot of talk about labour supply and labour costs, but certainly as a service company operating in the service sector, and many of the companies we invest in are involved in services. If you can't create the right and nurture the right talent and continue to encourage people to join your organization and to give them a career path, then I think the sustainability of your business model is going to be called into question. And I think this is one of the key risks that we're now trying to understand as we plan out and invest with companies that we think have good practices.
Thanks, Mark. And Julie, do you have?
No, I agree. And I think building on that, I think corporates now in the market are realizing that ESG is no longer in the fringe. It is here to stay, right? And I think you're right. I often describe to my North American and European colleagues that, we're still watching the pilot of a show and trying to decide whether we like it or not, and they're already on season 5. But I actually think, if we look at how Asia in general and the economies that we operate in, we have been very adoptive, right? Look at technologies, look at how we do fintech and everything else. I think we will accelerate at a much greater speed as the rest of the world if we get our acts together. Regulatory schemes, mandatory reporting is accelerating as well. I don't know what industry the audience is from, but at least what we're seeing is there's just a flurry of activities, not just JVs, but M&As, right, that are happening in whatever industry you're in. Corporates are really good at now looking beyond ESG from a risk perspective and looking at it from a business opportunities perspective. And people are much more willing to spread best practices. Look at us all here today as a very good example. We're also looking at ESG in the market slightly differently. We're looking at it from an opportunity. Like you said, how do we attract talent? How do we differentiate ourselves with our competitors in that sense? Cheaper financing, cheaper loans. And within organizations, I think there are some really interesting characteristics emerging as well. We at Schneider, we believe that most successful companies that are there to tackle ESG, they always start with, especially when it comes to climate change, they start with a strategy. And then the most important thing is to look at digitization. And we have gone through a digital transformation period in the last few years, and we're continuing through that. And I think organizations are moving beyond the discussion of strategizing, digitizing, and really talk about implementation, right? What can we specifically do to decarbonize? Discussions are moving beyond ESG departments to other departments, procurement, marketing, finance. Everyone's now involved in these discussions. ESG outcomes are being embedded in personal KPIs and executive KPIs, and we're also seeing more adoption of that in the Asia markets. And I think last but not least, definitely supplier engagement. I mean, we all know that but it's not surprising that 90% of environmental impact comes from our supply chains. I think here being in Asia, we definitely have a huge role to play. So I think social and governance factors will be looked at more closely as we tackle the supply chain issue across ES&G as well.
Thanks, Julie. And Amar, do you have anything you'd like to add about risks and opportunities in the investment portfolio?
Yeah, what I'd add a little bit to what Julia was adding, the importance of supply chain. That's a big topic, and I think we are sort of getting into season 2, moving from season 1 to season 2 in APAC.
You bought the pilot.
In APAC on that one, this topic that is abbreviated as Scope 3 emissions. What are your customers doing, and what are your suppliers' emissions are. It's a big topic, and in terms of what BlackRock is looking from the companies, we're not prescribing that companies need to have their Scope 3 emissions data available right now or in the next year. But we think that companies, particularly in the carbon-intensive sectors, need to be having a plan how they're going to get the reliable Scope 3 data. And that's a big topic, I think, over the next year or two. Related to that, a little bit of what BlackRock has been doing on the stewardship side of sustainability is, I mentioned, we want our investee companies to be reporting on a framework that's comparable globally. And the internationally comparable frameworks are TCFD and SASB/ISSB. Now, SASB has been converting to ISSB. That process is going on right now. In the last 18 months, we've been emphasizing TCFD. And the reason these international frameworks are important, if you're on the corporate side on reporting and you look at your ESG rankings by one ESG rating provider versus another and a third, you'll find that the correlations are very poor, very, very poor. And a major reason, one reason is that they have different methodologies and weightings. But the other reason is that the data is poor. And when the data is not there, then these ESG rating companies have to extrapolate or interpolate what are other companies in the sector in this country doing, and let's assume that this company is doing the same. But they extrapolate, interpolate in different ways, and then again they get different results. So the poor data is a major reason why ESG ratings are all over the place. And as an asset manager, we need a little bit more coherence in the ESG rankings. And so if companies are all reporting by international frameworks, it helps with that comparability from market to market. And so what we've been looking at since last year, whether companies are reporting by TCFD, if the companies are not reporting by TCFD, if they don't have their data on emissions, if they don't have targets, part of the TCFD reporting pillars, then we vote against directors. We vote against re-election, one executive director. For Asia, the view we're taking is the executive directors are responsible, and then the non-executive directors should also be exercising oversight. So we will vote against one the executive director that we identify as probably most accountable in this area, and one probably the longest serving non-executive director. Last year, we had about 400, give or take almost 400 companies in our climate universe for Asia Pacific. We voted against about a third of the directors about a third of the companies. We had at least one or two directors we voted against. But the good news is, last year to this year, the number of companies that are reporting by TCFD has shot up in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, and some of the other countries in Asia, and even China. A number of the large companies are also now reporting by TCFD. So we're coming towards the end of the so-called AGM season, the voting season, which is basically end of June. The run rate now, it's looking like this year we voted against half as many as last year. So last year was about a third. This year is somewhere in the mid-teens of the companies that we're voting against because of poor disclosure. And so I think disclosures have improved significantly over the last 1 year in Asia.
Right. Thanks, Samar. And it's interesting that you think that it's the trend is improving, right? It's a positive trend that fewer companies are, more companies are improving their TCFD recommendations, disclosures. And so, Mark, what do you think? Do you have any advice or recommendations for companies that are just starting out or want to improve their disclosures? Is there anything you'd want to
Yeah, maybe just to build on Amar's point a little bit. The disclosure is the start of it, because if companies are unwilling to disclose, there's no conversation to have. There's nothing to track. They can't set targets, and you can't remediate. So for us, it's all about helping companies understand the need to get on the journey. And it's encouraging to hear that is starting to become more common practice. I mean, it's also assisted, of course, by the various authorities in the region and the stock exchanges, whether it's here or Thailand or Singapore or elsewhere, where it's now becoming a requirement to disclose pertinent data. The issue of standardization is a complex one, because of course you've got different competing jurisdictions, each wanting to have their own standards, and then you've got financial reporting standards. So it's a real alphabet soup in terms of what you do and how you do it. And I don't think there's any easy answer to that. But certainly as an investor in companies, it's the willingness of the management, and the advice really is to make sure this is an initiative from the top down. I was on a conference call recently, and somebody made a clever remark that in the US, it's boards that have to convince management to get on the journey, whereas from their experience in this part of the world, it's management that needs to convince boards. And I can see elements of that through our interaction. So really for us, our board got aligned very early on, and that has set the tone for the whole organization. And the board's active in the process, so we have an ESG committee at the total group level, which then sort of permeates down into the organization. But the members of the board that participate on that committee are very, very active and very engaged. And that's critical because really nothing happens in terms of alignment unless it starts from the very top. And if anyone here or is on the visual, audio-visual, it really is about getting the engagement at the very top of the company. And that's my advice. And the technicals will work out. In fact, there are multiple standards, and it's really difficult to work your way through the lexicon and all the rest of it. Leave that to the technical people. They'll come up with the right answer, and they'll sit on the right committees. But the willingness to be on the journey and get comfortable with measurement and disclosure and commitment to outcomes, that's really, really critical. Because we're not going to do, no one organization, even if you're the biggest asset manager in the world, like BlackRock, or a large asset owner like AIA, none of us are going to do it on our own. We all operate within our own professional communities. And what we're seeing in terms of how change is occurring, it's by working together to establish common standards and common practices and to implement them, with conviction. And to, at the end, we don't like saying demand adherence to standards, but that is effectively what we're doing. Because at some point, if our investee companies don't get with the program, we won't be deploying capital. And it won't be only us, it will be those around us in our community as well. And ultimately, the cost of capital will go up for companies that aren't willing to get on the journey.
Thanks, Mark. So I think, you think it's important for management to take the lead to push some of the initiatives.
Yeah, I would say the board first and foremost. The origins, I think, management has a responsibility to understand the context and to relay that to stakeholders, including the board. But the board really has to believe it, and it's a process, because all of us have been educated in an environment where financial outcomes are number one, right? All we need to do is generate financial outcomes and we met our objectives. And today that's not true. We have a broader set of responsibilities, and we have to recognize it first, otherwise the organization doesn't move.
Thanks, Mark. And Julie?
No, I agree, and I think education at all levels plays a huge part as well, right? I think, some of us have been in ESG for a long, long time. Some of us are new to it, especially the talent shortage that you were talking about. There are actually a lot of young professionals that are interested in the ESG topic, especially climate change, and they want to be part of it. So I think as an organization, as the private sector, we also have a role and a responsibility to educate our colleagues about, why we're here, what got us here today, what is the science behind it, and how can we all play a role in our individual capacity, whether or not you have a job that ties to ESG or sustainability or not. What does that mean day to day? I think it has to happen across the board. And when you have that pressure from the organization to do something, I think the boards will have to listen as well, and consumers too.
It's a great rallying call within an organization. There's plenty of data to support the statement that companies with purpose outperform. And what better purpose than to adopt principles around ESG, which gives you a connectivity and a purpose relative to the communities in which you operate.
Thanks, Mark. And Amar, would you have anything any advice that you'd want to give to companies that?
Well, I would just reiterate what Mark is saying, that it has to come from the board. And the risk is, in Hong Kong and a lot of other markets, it's the regulator, Hong Kong Exchange, has these ESG rules, so we have to follow the ESG, we have sustainability, we'll do a sustainability, we can get PwC or somebody to the report, take it to the board. But at the board, when it comes, the board of directors get this report maybe 5 days before the meeting, and then what sort of discussion is there on the board? Is it, oh yeah, we've read it, pass, 2 minutes. Right? That is not board oversight. But until and unless, it's not a responsibility of one board member. We're not looking for one board member who's a climate specialist. But all board members should be fluent in this issue. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities for the company? And what is the company doing about it? You have strategy, you have sustainability reports that are on page 30 or 40 of the annual report or somewhere else in the website. When you look at the chairman's statement, the CEO statement, no reference. If that is, that in itself tells the investor that they're doing it for the sake of compliance. And it's not yet integrated into core strategy and the purpose of the company. So just to reiterate Mark's point, it has to come from the board. I think directors need to know what questions to ask. There's a whole revamping of board director education that needs to take place. And I think directors should be willing and encouraged to meet investors, to find what investors are actually interested in and looking for. Because at the moment, the board is getting the information from the management, but the board is supposed to oversee the management. But the board is getting all the information filtered by the management that they are meant to oversee. And when we ask to meet with independent directors, et cetera, companies say, well, I mean, there are exceptions, and exceptions here in the room, but by and large, when we ask to meet independent directors, the company says, it's not in their job spec. We don't ask our directors, independent directors, to meet investors. So I think that has to change so that the mentality on governance and on ESG goes beyond compliance.
Thanks, Tamar. Well, we've talked a bit about educating board and management, but we've also touched a bit about the talent shortage in the ESG talents in the industry, and maybe I think we could address that. How does your organizations address this challenge? Is there enough ESG talents in the company? Is there enough those with the technical skills, the specialties, and does your organizations have any in-house training programs or initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to all of that is yes. It's a change in approach, and if you think about it from an investment point of view, we have successive generations of analysts and portfolio managers who have been trained in finance to plow through the published material and come up with valuations and recommendations relating to the opportunities that are presented. And that training is coming out of business schools that at that time did not put a high emphasis on some of these issues. So it's been a process of ongoing re-education and career development. With younger members that are coming in now, they come in with a different approach. They come in with a sense of purpose, and it's very critical to them for their personal development that they know they're working in an organization that holds these issues very strongly and takes them very seriously. So it's a combination. Large companies need to mobilize their workforces, need to provide constant education and development opportunities. And it needs a very strong top-down message. So if you pick up, exactly what Amar says, if you pick up the annual report, you get a strong sense of what the mission of the company is, what their purpose is, and what their commitment is to measurement, disclosure, how it links to their business model. It's intriguing because we've just come through a very strong period in terms of stock market performance up until 2 years ago, or beginning of this year, let's say, where people didn't care so much about disclosures, right? You had all these sort of governance-light opportunities to invest internationally, and it was all about financial outcomes and very limited disclosure. I think now the dust is settling as we're into a new phase of the economy. I think there's going to be much more emphasis on this, and in terms of people's sort of constant knowledge building, one of the things we're doing going into next year is that all of our frontline investment professionals, 250 people, will need to be accredited by the CFA. They have launched a new ESG program, and all of our financial analysts and all of our portfolio managers will need to be accredited by that to continue in their current roles, and that will be a requirement and a prerequisite going forward. So, strong message from the company, but also strong facilitation. We'll support everybody through that, and that will permeate out. Interesting, maybe just last point, when we announced that our frontline investment professionals need to do the course, many other people said they want to do it as well because they're interested in the theme, they want to be part of this mobilization, and they want to understand the issues.
Thanks, Mark. And actually, I guess it's not just the investment, community as well. I've also taken the, CSGA thing. So, journalists as well. I think it's important to equip ourselves with the knowledge about what's going on. And actually, lastly, Amar and Julie, would you have anything you'd like to add about this, the talent ESG?
Yes, for us, I think I mentioned our mission is to be the digital partner for sustainability and efficiency, right? So in Schneider, digital, technology, and sustainability/ESG comes hand in hand. So we look at it less from a reporting, disclosure perspective, but really what does that look like in terms of implementation, right? How do we get this done? How do we tackle these challenges on the ground? And one thing I personally was quite inspired is we're going through our talent review process now, and I come from a management consulting background, so I'm quite familiar with how good talent management should look like. But what I realized is we've actually embedded digital citizenship as one of the key criteria of how we look for talent within Schneider Electric. And it was really eye-opening for me because we always kind of bury that in the sandbox in organizations, and we look at other KPIs, but actually, in the 21st century, especially I think Richard Lancaster mentioned, we have the technologies that are here. We need to know how to use it. We need to deploy it, and we need talent to be able to know how to put it all together end to end. So for me, it's about educating not just on sustainability, on ESG, but also on digital technologies and how to become true digital citizens so that we can make things happen instead of just talking about it going forward.
All right, thank you very much. I think we've run out of time, so I'd like to thank our panelists again for an insightful discussion. And thank you all for joining, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.